Well, I just received this book a few days ago in the mail. It's called A New Testament Biblical Theology, and it's subtitled The Unfolding of the Old Testament in the New Testament. This is just published by Baker Bookhouse in Grand Rapids. The origin for the book, actually, the very inception of it was when I was teaching a course on New Testament theology at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and I began to develop the ideas for this book that I'll talk about in a moment at that time, and I've continued to teach a course on New Testament theology since then, every other year at least, sometimes every year. In about 1997, I wrote an article called The Eschatological Conception of New Testament Theology, which really was putting together my New Testament theology course in a way I hadn't done yet, in about 45 or 50 pages. And I continued to work on this. I seriously began to pursue finishing this book about 3 or 4 years ago. And essentially what this book is, it is not a New Testament theology. There are many of those, especially over the last 5 to 7 years. A number of New Testament theologies, especially by evangelical scholars, have come out. And but this, I'm titling this A New Testament Biblical Theology. Now that may seem like not much of a difference. But from my perspective it is, because most of the New Testament theologies, if you look at them, they're organized really by going typically, for the most part, book by book, according to the order of the New Testament canon. And they'll either analyze each book and at the end summarize the major themes that they have distilled from that summary, or they'll choose some themes at the very beginning of each book, and they'll study those themes in the book. The New Testament biblical theology that I am writing doesn't go by that plan. What I do is I have a major section at the beginning of the book on Old Testament biblical theology, and for about 60 or so pages I develop that, and I summarize that with a what I call a storyline, a redemptive historical storyline. In one sentence it summarizes Old Testament biblical theology. And then in succeeding chapters I show how that Old Testament storyline is developed and begins to be transformed by the New Testament. And then what I do is I take each part of that New Testament storyline, and each part becomes the plan for the rest of the book. That is, the parts of the storyline end up structuring the rest of the book. And within each part of the storyline, I'll move through different parts of the New Testament, sometimes canonically, but not always. In some books I will not touch upon. So I suppose the best way to describe this book is twofold in terms of what I see to be perhaps a contribution, which in the eyes of some may just be more of an emphasis than you find in other New Testament theologies, but I think it's a little bit more. I think my book is apples and the other New Testament theologies are oranges, and they weren't attempting to do what I'm doing in this book. So I'm not criticizing them for doing it in a way differently from mine. I just saw that my approach was one perhaps that was needed. So what I've done is I've essentially argued that every major notion in the New Testament is rooted in the Old Testament. If you want to understand it, go to the Old Testament. Secondly, I argue that every major notion in the New Testament is part of what could be called an already and not yet end-time idea. That the end times, we often think the end times are just future, but in reality, if you study that phrase, latter days, end times, last hour, consummation of the ages, in the New Testament, and when I did that I was shocked. I found that none of them, well, for the most part, most of them were not exclusively future. But they talked about the latter days having begun with the coming of Christ, how they were ongoing as people like Paul and Peter and John were writing their works, but they weren't consummated, but they would be in the future. And so the apostles breathed what I call eschatological air. They were in an eschatological atmosphere, and they couldn't help but breathe that eschatological air, so that as it went through the lungs of their brains, if you will, out came major notions that they understood to relate to Christ and the believer. And these notions were highly charged end-time notions. Now, if you don't approach the New Testament by seeing every one of its notions rooted in the Old and every one of its notions being already and not yet end-time idea, yes, one certainly will still understand the New Testament. I wouldn't say you would understand the New Testament wrongly, but what I would say, you'll understand it more richly if you see its Old Testament roots and its inaugurated latter-day ideas expressed in every major notion. Let me give you a few examples of what I mean. I have a number of chapters after I really established the New Testament redemptive historical storyline, chapters on the idea of already and not yet eschatology, and then I move into the resurrection of Christ. And I have a number of chapters, Gospels, and Acts, Paul, general epistles and Revelation, going through and showing how resurrection is extremely central to the New Testament. In fact, it's mentioned more than the death of Christ. That's not to say the death of Christ is unimportant, but Jesus' resurrection is a farther movement on from the death, redemptive historically. And so the resurrection is an immensely, highly charged end-time idea. How so? Well, at the very end of the world, when people enter the new creation, they will participate in that through being resurrected, of course, bodily, but also spiritually. And we find that Jesus is the first bodily resurrected person. And he is the first one to be a literal latter-day new creation in this old age. The new creation is penetrated back through him, and as he sends his Spirit, the Spirit then becomes the life giver. It is the one who raised Jesus, and it is the one who raises us. First, we're raised spiritually, as John 5 says, "A time is coming and now is when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live." That's right now. But it goes on to say a time is coming when all in the tombs will hear his voice and will rise bodily. It's an already and not yet resurrection, first spiritual for believers and then bodily at the end of the age. So our regeneration is a resurrection. And it's because it's an end-time resurrection because it's identified with Jesus' resurrection, which was the beginning of a latter-day new creation. So that's a good example of an end-time doctrine. And this notion of Jesus' resurrection as a latter-day new creation permeates the whole New Testament. And it's important to see our resurrection is not, when Paul says we've been raised, the old man's been laid aside, the new man, we put on the clothes of the new man in Colossians 3, for example. That's not just saying that we've become like resurrected beings, but in fact, we actually have begun to be real and true resurrected beings. Why? Some will say, well, it's just a spiritual resurrection. It's not a physical resurrection. That can't be a true resurrection. But in the Old Testament, like Daniel 12:2, when it predicted the resurrection, it would be a time in which not just the body would be raised, but the spirit. And so when our spirit is raised, that's the first stage of the beginning fulfillment of the end-time resurrection. And then when our body is raised at the end, that's the consummation of it. And so that really becomes a number of chapters going through and showing how important resurrection is. And here I build on the work of Richard Gaffin, who wrote a book called The Centrality of the Resurrection in Paul, but also Se-Yoon Kim, who argued that Paul's Damascus Road experience with Christ dominated all of his epistles. And of course, that Damascus Road encounter was an encounter with the Lord Jesus Christ as resurrected. And so I've tried to build on their shoulders and to carry their thought further in this regard. So I have a number of other chapters, one on justification, for example, in which I show that justification is again, it's an end-time doctrine. It's pushing back the end-time judgment into the present. Christ takes that judgment, and yet our identification with Christ's resurrection is a vindication of our righteousness in Him, and that's a part of positive justification. The resurrection, of course, being an end-time notion. We're identified with Him as the exalted end-time Adam in the beginning of the new creation. Sanctification, or Christian living, another example of end-time new creational living, set apart from the old world, set apart to the new. The Colossians 3 passage, reiterated in Romans 6 essentially, and Ephesians 4. Colossians 3 again saying, you've laid off the clothes of the old man, you put on the new man. We've been separated from the old world definitively in being set apart. And we've been set apart to Christ as a new man. And who is that man? Well, that man is the new man, Jesus Christ, with whom we're identified. We're no longer identified with the old man, Adam. So that just elaborates a little bit on this New Testament biblical theology. My own work comes closest to the biblical theologies. They're actually called that, New Testament biblical theologies, but they're in German. One by Peter Stuhlmacher. His is about to come into English translation through Erdman's in a year approximately. Also, Hans Hubner has a New Testament biblical theology. Again, it's in German, and that's not in the process of being translated. Mine comes closest to theirs in the sense that they're trying to root the New Testament in the Old. I'm trying to do that in a much more rigorous manner than they did. And again, that may not have been, of course, their aim to do it in the depth that I am. So that gives one, I think, an idea of what I'm doing and why I'm calling this a New Testament biblical theology and not just a New Testament theology. And so I think in terms of students and perhaps scholars, I think there'll be an interest to see what I'm doing with this notion of New Testament biblical theology. And likewise, with pastors and interested Christian readers, I think it'll be very important, regardless of how much you have or have not been exposed to the idea that every one of the New Testament notions is rooted in the Old, and every one of them is a facet of an already and not yet latter-day idea. And if you haven't been exposed to that, I think this will be a good book for you. If you have been exposed to it, I think this book will flesh out perhaps whatever you have learned in the past.